Okay. All right. So I'm talking to Simon Jarrett. I'm very pleased that you're here, Simon. Who's a historian who works in the disability area, and I'd like you to tell us how you got interested in all of this.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and I'm a really big fan of UK Disability History Month. So, the way in which I got involved, my speciality really is the history of learning disability, history of people with learning disabilities, and so my interest arose from my working career really. And I started out as a childcare worker with learning disabled children a few decades ago. Had a short spell in a what was then called a mental handicap hospital, working with people with learning disabilities who'd lived in a hospital for all their lives, and then spent many years working with people who came back to the community. And I was always very interested in what the history was behind these people, and how it was that they'd ended up in these institutions, and what had happened before the institutions. And that developed into an academic interest, and culminated with me writing my book about the last 300 years of learning disability history, which is called Those They Called Idiots, History of the Disabled Mind.
Very good. Before we get on to that, which is fascinating, an earlier project that you were the historian on was the Historic England, or English Heritage, I think they were before, project on disability in time and place. And I think you wrote a 70-odd page essay to go along with the very geographically based and archaeological project, because really looking at the artifacts that have been left behind and trying to put some flesh on the bones of those artifacts. So tell us how you approached that, and what were the main things that came out of that project for you.
Yeah, that was a really interesting project. This was back in 2011, and as you say, they were known as English Heritage then. They're now known as Historic England, and they approached me to be the web writer for a resource that is still up on their website. And what they wanted to do was explore the history of the buildings that they were responsible for in relation to disability. So I thought that was a really interesting project for a number of reasons. First of all, I was delighted that a big publicly funded body was prepared to take a look at how disability history had been part of their history, and not always in a positive way. And it also was a great opportunity to explore this sort of rather ambivalent connection between people with disabilities and buildings in which people with disabilities have lived, and how much of a part of that history the buildings have been. A lot of disability history in the past, and still some in the present, is often about buildings. It's about asylums and specialist hospitals and so on, where people with disabilities have ended up. But of course, what we know about the history is that that is only a part of it. The vast majority of people with disabilities, and we're talking all disabilities here, we're talking, blindness, deafness, physical impairments, and so on. The vast majority of people have always lived in their communities. They've not lived in buildings. Even at the height of the asylum era in the 19th century, most people were not living in asylums or institutions. So this project gave a really good chance to explore that, and Historic England were quite happy for me to introduce into the discussion this whole idea about how, while some people were in specialist buildings, most people weren't. So you got that sort of interplay, that tension, that connection between community and institution that's always been a part of the history.
I mean, I was particularly struck by two things when I read that. One was the riot that took place in a Norfolk place for people with leprosy.
Leprosy.
And I wonder if you can say, there's probably not much information, which is why there isn't much information in the thing, but how did you come across that story, and what is it in its context? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, this was, I was trying to find stories that sort of illustrated what was actually happening at the in a particular period with particular groups of people. And this was about a group of people with leprosy who were in what was known as a leper house at the time in Norfolk. And I actually found it in a brilliant book by Carol Rawcliffe about the history of leprosy in England in the Middle Ages. And what was really interesting for me about this story was that the conditions in this leper house had been particularly bad, and they had a particularly sort of abusive and exploitative overseer. And the people that actually lived in this institution rose up in revolt, and there was a very serious riot in which they killed the overseer's dog, attacked the people who were responsible for running the place, and made very vigorous representations about the terrible conditions they were living in, the poor food, and everything else. So two things were really interesting about this, apart from the fact that it happened, which was brilliant. But first of all, when it went to law, the law came right down on their side, and actually felt that all their grievances were justified, their actions were justified, demanded wholesale changes in the place and changes to the regime, and so on. And so what that was saying to me was, we probably think, if we try to imagine a medieval leper house in our minds, of very passive people being cared for and done to, and it was very far from that, and what Carol Rawcliffe also showed was that many leper houses actually had excellent standards of care and support. People went in and out of them. They weren't just isolated there. People could lead reasonable lives in these sorts of places. But the other really interesting thing about the Norfolk case was that the law came down on their side. They had popular support from the village. So that said to me that this image we have of the disabled leper who has lost limbs or has gone blind or whatever, who is shunned by the rest of the community, is far from how things actually were. That people did have links to their communities. Some lepers lived amongst them, others lived in specialist leper houses, but they were far from shut off from, kicked out of, isolated from the world that everyone else lived in.
I suppose we look at it, and which is what's so fascinating about your most recent book, is we look at it through the 19th century lens of institutionalization. It's hard for us to get back beyond that, but it's a fascinating example. The other one was the census you came up with from Norwich, I think, which showed that there were, out of 1,400 people or something, there were 60 identified disabled people, and they were all living ordinary lives, and most of them were married, which again goes against the stereotypes. So anything to say on that one? Because it's, again, you're doing that, challenging us, I think, through what you're finding.
Yeah, census of Norwich was carried out in the 16th century, and people went door to door through the poorest part of Norfolk. And it was actually a census of the poor. They were trying to work out what sort of conditions the poor were living in, whether poor relief was adequate for them to survive, and so on. I mean, it was quite a sort of progressive thing that was being done anyway, but included in this was really fascinating itemization of the number of people who were disabled amongst, within this poor community. And it was very counterintuitive to what we are told about how people with disabilities have been treated or how they have lived in the past. And so most people were married, as you say, most people were working. There was a blind baker who was in his 90s, I think, who was still working. And something very interesting that came out of this was that there were sometimes these very practical marriage or family arrangements where people with one type of disability would be married to a person with another type of disability or a person without a disability would be, and that through mutual support they managed to survive. And actually it was the case that most of the disabled people who were married weren't married to other disabled people. They were just, married to people that didn't have disabilities. So it just seemed again to me to show a level of integration and community acceptance, and just sort of people believing that people with disabilities um, belonged in mainstream communities and didn't belong somewhere else. So there was no sense of people having to go off and live in any sort of institution. Communities found a way of adapting to these things. And I do think what comes out of both this and the leprosy story is that we're still very influenced by the 19th century account of what used to happen. And I think that 19th century account, which was mostly written by asylum doctors and superintendents and policymakers, was to paint a picture of disabled people as not surviving in the community, of being exploited and abused or not coping or being objects of pity, which justified the building of institutions. But if you step back and strip away that 19th century portrayal of all types of disability, really, you find a very different picture. And I think that's the picture we really need to start understanding about the pre-19th century.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. And that resource is still available, as you say, and it's a really useful one. And what's also useful about it is there are examples all over the country, so you can go somewhere fairly local to start digging into this.
Yeah.
But your more sort of bigger study, which you've just published, I think, tell us how you got started on that, and particularly what you found in the period of the 18th century, which just feeds on from what you were just talking about.
Well, it all started when a friend of mine sent me a link to the Old Bailey Online, which was fantastic, which is a fantastic web resource where they've digitized the accounts of all the criminal trials that took place in the Old Bailey from the end of the 17th century right through to the beginning of the 20th century. And it included a lot of 18th century trials. And just out of interest, I started putting in search terms using the vocabulary of the time, like idiot and fool and witless and all these other remarks, and found incredible accounts of trials for people who are in for sort of fairly minor offences like pickpocketing or theft or shoplifting, but who potentially face the death penalty under the 18th century penal code, but who were described as idiots, or he's half an idiot, or he's a very foolish lad, he's weak, he's easy. And these were all terms that related to people who were believed to have a lack of intelligence. What was amazing about these stories was what emerged from the accounts in the trials was that these people were surrounded by family, friends, employers. They were very embedded in their communities. People would often come to trials to speak on their behalf, and always say, look, he's a poor foolish lad, he shouldn't have stolen this, but if you acquit him, we'll look after him, we'll make sure he doesn't get into trouble again. So there's a tremendous amount of commitment to people, and invariably juries and judges would acquit people in those circumstances. And that made me start to think, blimey, to what extent were people integrated? Is this a true picture that's emerging from these trials? So in the book, I expanded that research, and a lot of research, and I think this is a problem, had said, look, we've looked in all the institutions in the 18th century and we can't find so-called idiots. So they must have been living terribly isolated lives, and chained up in cellars or beaten or hidden away in attics and everything, which is an interesting assumption in its own right, because why would you assume that if people weren't in institutions? And what I did was I went and looked in much more mainstream sources. So I looked in civil trials as well as criminal trials. I looked in art and caricature. I looked in portrayals in novels and so on, diaries, and just found an incredible amount of integration and inclusion. I'm not idealizing it. Obviously, there were cases of abuse and exploitation, but a lot of people got abused and exploited in the 18th century. It wasn't peculiar to this group. So what I tried to do in the book was then track this arc from how come people had been seen as people who could live integrated lives in communities in the 18th century to people who needed to be excluded and put into institutions 100 years later.
And what do you think were the main, we haven't time to go through the whole of that, but what were the main determinants that brought about this change? And I'm mindful when you wrote the history of place and time, that the several times you say, and the beginning of segregation is happening here, that you point to examples of it happening earlier in the 18th century and so on. What do you think was driving that as the main determinants? We can obviously say industrialization, but what specific social things do you think led to that change?
Yeah, and I don't entirely buy the argument that industrialization was an inevitable cause of institutionalization and asylums. But there was a move towards the 18th century, particularly for people who were mentally ill, from middle class families to go into small institutions. So there was, I think, beginning to develop a sense of shame within families about somebody who was different to everybody else at that time. So that was starting. It was not happening in the poorer communities, partly because of lack of resources, but also I think there was a different cultural attitude. I argue in the book that there was a huge change which all centered around the French Revolution, and that had a huge effect in this country, both on left-wing and right-wing thinking. So left-wing people who embraced the French Revolution had this idea of an idealized man, as they would have put it then, idealized human, who would be a full citizen and exercise all their rights and be a fully participating member of society. So they were building towards a utopia of ideal humans. On the right, there was this huge fear of the revolution from France being imported to this country, and there was a huge fear, therefore, of anybody who was different. What they saw in France was the lower classes rising and above their place and taking over. So I think people with disabilities were caught in a pincer movement, really, between the sort of idealism of the left and the fear and terror of the right, which made it more and more difficult for them to be fully participating members of society.
And there's no doubt that we do see then, as we go into the 19th century, more and more institutions, the 1908 Asylum Act and the 1851, and then from the Poor Law reform, the change from out relief to in relief with a very harsh regime. And before very long, I think the majority of people in those workhouses were old and disabled.
Yes. Yeah, so what you have going alongside this is you have a growing state, a state bureaucracy, which becomes more and more responsible for more and more things. So back in the 18th century and earlier, you'd had a lot of local parish communities which basically tried to sort out their own problems whenever they happened. So, somebody didn't quite fit in, the parish would just find a way of getting them to fit in. You have this growing state bureaucracy, which starts a sort of state asylum building program from the beginning of the 19th century, which accelerates throughout that century. And you're quite right, poor law changed. They used to talk about outdoor relief and indoor relief. And a modern translation for those two things would be outdoor relief would be community care and indoor relief would be institutional care. So small amounts of money used to be given to people just to enable them to survive in their own homes. With the new Poor Law Act in the 1830s, it all changed to indoor relief, and it became a form of punishment, really. They'd make workhouses and places so uncomfortable that you were only in there if you genuinely couldn't work. And that's why the elderly, people with disabilities, so-called idiots, ended up filling in these workhouses and then moving to the asylums. So just to give you a figure, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were around 10,000 people in some sort of institutional care in England. By the end of the 19th century, there were over 100,000, and it was continuing to grow.
Mm. I mean, that's really interesting. And then toward the end of the 19th century, you've got people, an added dimension with sort of eugenicists coming on the scene, people like Mary Dendy and a whole lot of other people are saying, really, these people will undermine the gene pool if we don't lock them all away. And so that adds an extra push to the whole thing, doesn't it?
Yes, it really did. And, I argue quite strongly these eugenicist views didn't just come out of nowhere after Darwin in the 1870s with Dendy and other people like that you mentioned, that there'd been a build up towards this thinking throughout this century. And what started to happen with the eugenicist movement, which drew on Darwin's theory of evolution and heredity, was that families started to be blamed for any disability amongst them. And for families, read poor families. Okay, so imbecility, disease, deformity, as they called it, started to be seen as a product of the feckless lower classes, if you like. So it was bad breeding, alcoholism, criminality, all of this. There was this sort of huge libel, really, against the poorer classes, and the eugenics movement built on this. And so then the idea came that, well, if disability and other problems come from certain classes behaving in certain ways, you can eliminate it. Okay, if you stop these classes breeding and you encourage the middle classes and above to breed more, then we're back to creating this sort of idealized society of superhumans. And it was all nonsense, of course, but it was a very prevalent view across society and across the ideological spectrum from the end of the 19th century and through most of the 20th.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so many people were pulled into it. People are quite shocked when you read quotes from D.H. Lawrence or H.G. Wells and so on, who are all supporting this. So quite interesting. But at the same time, Charles Booth did his house-to-house survey in London and found still, despite the incarceration, there were still, as you say, large numbers of people living in the community, even when that pressure to put people away was at its greatest, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think every society that has tried to incarcerate, those of its citizens that they see as not fitting in and who they sort of want to eliminate, if you like, from their society, has always failed to do so. Yeah, because of the sheer numbers and the costs involved, and the impossibility, really, of imposing that amount of regulation. But of course, that was also driven by the sort of fallacies of their eugenic theories, because they didn't really know how disability came about. They didn't really know why some people were born who they classified as imbeciles or idiots and other people weren't. And the whole eugenic heredity thing was a nonsense. One of the things that the social reformers towards the end of the 19th century started to do was, this was Roundtree and others, was to start to say that poverty and disease and poor health and so things were environmental, and there was nothing really hereditary about it at all. But these were caused by the terrible living conditions that a lot of people were living in. And that's why you saw more of it in the poorer classes than you saw in the comfortable middle classes. But of course, disability never went away from the comfortable middle classes either.
It was just hidden more. I think so that the root of the nature nurture, well, it wasn't the root because that goes right back to the Greeks, I think, but it was certainly very prevalent there. And I'm reminded of the 1908 Royal Commission, where there's a quote in it which says that a woman who's an imbecile who has a child, that child is 7 times more likely than she is to be have a learning difficulty or a learning disability. I mean, there's no factual basis for any of that, but it was the what people thought, wasn't it?
Yeah, and there was a sort of cottage industry of people sort of writing these accounts, which showed how these families sort of developed. So, and a lot of these came from America. There's a couple of very famous studies. One about the so-called Jukes family, and one about the so-called Kallikak family. They were both made-up names, and these things had family trees and everything. And the one about the Kallikaks showed that on one side of the family there'd been good breeding, but on the other side of the family, because of a night that one of the men in the family had spent with a barmaid in some pub in a poor area, this whole other line of people were developing who were criminals and alcoholics and had disabilities and imbeciles or morons, as they called it in America. And it had got family trees and photographs and accounts and interviews and everything to prove all this stuff. But all of this has been picked apart by researchers since, and it was just manufactured nonsense.
If someone didn't fit the family tree, they got left out. That sort of thing.
They got left out. They started with a premise, and then they just went to prove their premise. You know, so the worst type of social scientific research. But this stuff was seen as fact, and you know, I've always argued that sort of eugenic thinking was never really an ideology. It was a mindset, and it was a sort of shared assumption that people had in society.
And I mean, it goes right through, one could argue, into the present day, because after all, what was his name, the social psychologist at the London County Council, Cyril Burt, with his twin studies, which he falsified, and then he was on the major committee about what should happen to secondary education after the war, and he was the main proponent of testing by IQ at 11, which we're still getting with the SATs at 11. So it sort of continues this idea that you can sort people out in this way.
Absolutely, and you know, let's be honest. You know, Burt was a fraud. He produced completely fraudulent research about twins, as you say, and I think what's happened is we have come to fetishize IQ. You know, IQ was developed at the beginning of the 20th century because of universal education, and people were starting to see, you know, we've got children of different levels within classes. How do we separate them out? But because IQ gives you a number, it's seen as this sort of magic totem, you know. So you say, oh, that person's 71, so they don't have a disability, but that person scored 69, so they do have a disability. And it gives this sort of spurious scientific authenticity to it all. Whereas we all know, first of all, IQ is a lot of guesswork, and secondly, it measures a particular type of intelligence in particular circumstances. It says very, very little about people, really. But, you know, that what that has given us is the so-called meritocracy, where you have a society in which intelligence is regarded as the most important thing, and the most intelligent will rise to the top and do the most important jobs, while the less intelligent will remain behind. And I honestly think that underlies some of the great cultural and social splits that we have in society today.
And occasionally it's shown up, such as during a COVID pandemic, when the people who are not necessarily who've got through the meritocracy, but we're all suddenly dependent on them in a way that we disguise the rest of the time. So quite interesting, really.
It really was. And so suddenly people who were in these jobs that had been looked down on, like shelf stacking in supermarkets and collecting people's garbage and delivering things to places, we suddenly realized these were actually the most important people who glued society together. I didn't see any professors of history or philosophy being put on a key worker list at any time. With apologies to my dear colleagues in the field, but but that is a group who have been diminished by the idea of a meritocratic society where only educational qualifications matter, and that only people who can't manage to get educational qualifications do certain types of jobs. And I do think we've seen that playing out in election and referendum results recently. A sort of rebellion by those who are told that they're no good and don't fit and should know their place and stay where they are.
Yeah, interesting. I just wanted to go back into that transition from the 18th to the 19th century. You put quite a lot of emphasis on cartoons in popular magazines and so on, Gilray and others. What do you think influenced them to sort of caricature people as sort of half-wits or whatever else? Why did it suddenly come in the second half of the 18th century?
Well, I think it'd been around a long time. The reason caricaturists are interesting is that there was this so-called science of physiognomy, which said that your outer appearance reflected your inner being. And so people, certain facial and bodily characteristics denoted certain other things. So if you had a small nose, that meant you were an imbecile. If you had a low forehead, you were an imbecile. If you had a very high forehead, you were a genius, and all these things. So once you understand that code, you can start to read these caricatures in the way that people in the 18th and 19th century read them. And so you say, oh, right, okay, so that's a depiction of an imbecile. That's a depiction of a highly intelligent person. So what I love about these caricatures is, firstly, they tell us that. But secondly, they also show us that people were around. We talk about the history of disability as a hidden history. It's often not hidden. It's right there in front of us, but we're not seeing it. So you look at so many of those 18th century caricatures and paintings, particularly crowd scenes, you'll see a lot of people with disabilities in them. They're often not there for any symbolic reason. They're just there because they're there. If you had a crowd of people on a street in 18th century London, amongst them would be people with disabilities. So they're not being depicted as extraordinary or other or anything. They're just there because they're there. In some of the caricatures, they would sometimes be part of the joke, but it would be jokes like a very clever person doing something stupid and a supposedly stupid person in the background being much cleverer than the so-called clever person. So they did carry a bit of symbolism sometimes, but it was often quite affectionately drawn. So I think they're a great sort of indicator, really, of what day-to-day life for people with disabilities actually was in that period.
We started with an example of resistance back in the 13th century. What did you find in terms of resistance in this move to incarcerate everybody? What sort of examples of resistance were there from the inmates that were put in all of these places? Did you come across any?
It's from 19th century asylums. It's very difficult to get the the patient's voice, if you like, first-hand accounts. It's very much the medical voice that you hear. So, you have to do what we historians call read against the grain of the source and try and work out what's going on behind the medical person's words. But what you get more in the 20th century is you get oral history accounts of people that were in mental handicap hospitals, mental deficiency colonies, and that sort of thing. And what you get from that is the incredible resilience and the tremendous solidarity that people showed together, and the kindness they showed to each other, which they largely weren't getting from other people, and just how they survived these incredibly harsh regimes. And so people talk about people being weak and feeble. Well, they were actually incredibly strong and resilient. What you get in the 19th century and earlier 20th century is you get some interesting movements. So one of the things I wrote about on the website was the Guild of the Brave Poor Things, which was a self-help group of people with disabilities that started up in the late 19th century in Bath. And they sort of appropriated the language of the day, and called themselves the brave poor things, which is probably what a lot of other people called them. But they bonded together, and their symbol was a pair of crutches laid over each other on a shield, and they were drawing on the sort of military obsessions and terminologies of the late 19th century to say we're in a battle too, actually, and these are our weapons, and I just think that was an amazing movement.
Probably much more to be discovered by people like yourself. So thank you so much for sharing really what motivates you and some of the key things you've come up with. I think it's fascinating. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you for everything you do for this History Month, because I really think it's a brilliant series of events.
Thank you. Bye-bye then.